Today is Tuesday, February 7th, 2017. This is a special study session of the Prescott City Council. Roll call, please.
Mayor Oberg.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Lamerson.
Here.
Councilman Blair.
Yes.
Councilman Lozelle.
Here.
Councilwoman Orr.
Here.
Councilman Shiska.
Here.
Councilwoman Wilcox.
Here.
All present.
Thank you, everyone, for coming in today. This is a subject we've been discussing for probably a couple of months now, and we'll probably be continuing to discuss for a while longer as we try and look for options on how we're going to resolve our unfunded liability that we have in the PSPRS. So I think we've got a lot to cover here, so we'll move straight into discussion.
Item A, presentation and discussion of the Public Safety Personnel Retirement System funding options to include consideration of the sale of underutilized city properties.
Thank you, Dana. Mayor and Council, last week, I guess, the long list of options that the subcommittee and Council had looked at were narrowed down to the 6 that I have up on the screen. And direction from Council was to go through 1 or 2 of these every Council meeting to more fully discuss it and come up with options. So today we're taking the first 2 on, the borrowing and selling of unneeded property to pay down the liability. As we're putting this together, Councilwoman Orr had a question and wanted this graph included for discussion. So
Yes, thank you, Mark, and I appreciate your work on this last night and yesterday and early this morning. I would like to just, because I know we're going to discuss 1 and 2, I also wanted to present a chart that shows 3 and 4, which is possibly using some reserve and also dedicated sales tax. Because I've heard from several that we will never pay this down. And so, you know, we've seen the we've seen Mark's graph that shows how much we're paying. And if you look at this graph, that's the red line if we do nothing over the next 10 years. And then if you will look, if we were to, and I know these are just assumption dollars and assumption percentage, but if you were to do 4 million from reserve of general fund, then that would be the green line.
4 million and do nothing.
4 million and do nothing.
Right.
Thank you. So that's your green line. So the unfunded liability continues to skyrocket. If you were to do a 4 million or whatever amount in reserve and apply a 0.75 sales tax, you can see how the unfunded liability, what we are required to pay, goes down. In 10 years, we would be where we were in 2008. So I wanted this because I keep hearing this isn't doable. This is a solvable problem. And I think that this graph really shows, if you look at the light blue, that's basically, Mark, define that for me again. That is what we're paying.
It's what's referred to in the actuarial reports as the normal pension cost. So that's the cost of the pensions earned in the current year.
And so that stays
Yes.
under
And that
what
could
is
be
manageable within our general fund.
And that could be payable out of the general fund every
Yes.
year without.
Yes, yes, and it was
Exactly.
back, and it was a similar amount back in 2007, 2008.
So I just had this in my head, and I said, you know, let's put it down on paper so that we can show our citizens that this is a problem that we can fix. This is solvable, and this would work. And now, whether it's a 0.75, it's a 0.6, it's a 1, whatever it is, I do think there are one other thing I'd like to say before we move on is that whatever we do, whatever we decide to put on the ballot, it needs to be able to pass. So I think that needs to be a standard that we keep in mind. Can it pass? I think the second one is, will it work? We can do a lot of things, but if it doesn't bring down that unfunded liability, it's not really working.
But I also think,
I mean, it could be several things,
but I also think, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, once we got down to that level, if we went for a sales tax, it's manageable through the general fund without any more sales tax. So if it's sunsetted in 10 years,
That's right.
we could then handle that debt or liability, whatever word you want to put on it out there. But we're never going to pay it off until forever. It's based upon the fact that you're always going to have PSPRS Tier 1, Tier 2, people that are in that retirement program as well as their spouses. So it would be many, many, many years before you see zero. Is that a correct statement?
Well, you'll never see zero as long as you have police and fire employees.
Thank
Because
you.
you are always going to have that annual pension cost of the cost of their pension, whether it's tier 2 or tier 3. You know, it's a cost of having employees, is to pay health insurance, to pay their pension.
And thank you for bringing that up, because people need to hear it. It will not ever be paid off. It's a cost of doing business.
And Steve, what you were saying here, if I understand, that take care of this and in 10, 7, 9, whatever the year is, that we get it down to this manageable level, that council, whoever that is at the time, whether, I doubt if it's any of us, but then that council or a group could say, listen, we like we did with the road, they come back and say, we're looking for a 2.5 to make sure this is stable into perpetuity, but that's up to, at that time.
Well,
Jim will still be here, by the way. So.
and just to clarify,
Okay, let's go back to that chart for a
I
second.
had one other comment. I'm sorry. Yeah,
Let's go ahead and discuss this one. Does anybody have any other comments?
Well,
Questions on this
start here
chart?
and go around or come back. Doesn't matter.
Well, I think the one thing we need to say about this chart is, I like the progression of paying this thing off, but again, what we have to look at is we still don't know what we're going to have from Parker. We don't know if we're going to have a downturn. We don't know if we're going to make 2% additional each year on our sales tax revenue, that we're going to increase it by 2% every year. We heard Lynn Gilroy, the expert from Reason Foundation, the other day say it's going to be very difficult to meet their expected rate of return on their investments, just because of the nature of the market the way it is today. So, we'll continue to have additional expenses that we're going to have to figure out how to pay for. Now, the 0.75, I think, has a chance of doing that, but I think showing it being in 10 years, I think is not really being fair and honest with the voter. I think it's going to be a much longer period than that.
Well, and just to clarify, this information that I pulled for this and the assumptions all come from the 2016 valuation of our two trusts.
Sure, but
So
they
it's
don't
great.
bring in those uncertainties in. They have to have a static point at which they work from. You know that.
Yeah, every year
Yeah.
we do new valuations
Sure.
to take into account fluctuations in the market, and that's just the way you have to manage these things.
So you tell me they have already factored in the fact that there's going to be a market downturn?
No, I'm saying every year you have a new valuation
Sure, I
that
know
gives
that.
you, takes into account any changes, any lawsuits that might come up, or any fluctuation in the market, whether up or whether down,
Right.
or will be reflected in each of those years.
But what you
Today-
just said was that they don't already anticipate what the uncertainties are going to be in the future.
They anticipate and they make assumptions on those things, and those are what are in their evaluation.
Yeah, that's part of the actuarials, but they're not looking at a downturn.
They're
What they do
looking-
is they're looking at a expected rate of return of what, 7.4 for next year?
They're looking at a long-term expected rate of return of 7.4 next year.
And what are they actually making right now for the last 15 years?
Well,
4.8 the 5%, right?
their smooth rate is 6.6.
Yeah.
They're at around 5 or 6 for this year already, the current fiscal year, if you look at their latest investment report. And again, this is the way you value and you manage pensions, whether it's PSPRS or ASRS or Social Security or any of the federal pensions or any other pensions out there. This is the way you do it.
Yeah,
You
I understand.
can't know everything that's going to happen for the next 50 years.
And
You
all
make
I'm saying is that
assumptions.
with the uncertainties, we can't look at 10 years being sacrosanct. That's all I'm saying. Anybody else got any comments, questions on this one?
I have just one, Mayor.
Things on the button.
I would agree with you that we cannot sit back and say this thing is going to be absolutely paid off in 10 years. But in 10 years, then it's up to the people again. And we've got to, if it's not paid off and we need to pay more, then as far as I'm concerned, we need to go back to the people and give them a compelling story on why they should continue to support it. They could either support it or not support it, depending on the story we tell.
Yeah. Well, again, I agree with you. I think one thing we might want to do is not say 10 years, just say, that if we're going to use the .75, that it stays in effect until we're at 90 or 95% or 100%.
I can't agree with that, Mayor. I think that we need a drop dead date, and then we can go back to the folks and say, this is our situation, and what do you think?
There definitely needs to be a sunset.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you. I appreciate the chart. I agree with Harry that the idea of planning on earning a 7.5% return on any investment with what has been demonstrated by all investments over the last short period of time would be a mistake. Now, I appreciate the fact we're looking at possibly taking $4 million out of our reserves. On the other hand, I think I distinctly remember city manager talking about what common practice of running a municipality is for keeping in reserve for some sort of catastrophic event in a year or 2 or 3 or whatever the case was. That's number one. And then number two, I still haven't had the opportunity. I know it's coming. It'll be here because we're going to do this over and over until we get to where we have all these things resolved. I didn't see how much money we dumped in from selling off unused land out in the Big Chino that we only need a couple of 100 acres to drill and pump water from. We don't need thousands, and we didn't need this, and this out in Chino. We haven't seen any of that yet. So the $4 million may not be the number. It may be part of the number, but not the number. So that graph is somewhat not complete yet, and we're just getting there.
Councilwoman Wilcox.
Thanks, Mayor. None of us have a crystal ball. If we did, we'd be able to have an absolutely accurate chart. And I think all the qualifications have been explained. There have to be assumptions when you look into the future. And these are based on what you might call educated guesses or best information available. But clearly, if we use a combination of reserves, maybe replenish those reserves with money that we gain from selling excess properties, and look at some of these other options we have, we're going to be way ahead of the game in 10 years. I agree. We can't say to the voters, we're going to pay down, we're going to get our unfunded liability down to 0%. There are so many variables that go into this, and we don't have control of all of those variables. So this is a good picture of a good forecast based on the best information available today.
Councilwoman Orr, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Yes. So yeah, I would say my third point that I didn't get to make. Number one was, will it pass? Number two, will it work? Number three is that we need to keep it simple so that we can educate our citizens and our public about the necessities. Finally, we may not know that this is a for sure, but what we do know for sure is that red line. We know that that red line is going to continue to go up. And so I think that is one assumption we can all make for sure. So I think the sooner that we're able to get focused and get this done, educate the public, I think that's where I'd like to see us go. Thank you.
Councilman Lozelle.
This is just housekeeping, Mayor. I saw somebody raising their hand out there. Maybe you should explain how the study session goes, if there's going to be comment later.
Yeah, basically in the study session is for our benefit, and I can, during this study session, determine whether or not I'm going to take comments from the public. I think this is an important enough subject that we will take comments, but right now we're going to work with the from the dais up here and answer all the questions from everybody that's on the council for all the charts, and then I'll be going to the public. Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. Here again, I never said that this wasn't a positive graft. What I said was it was incomplete. If instead of just thinking about $4 million out of the reserves, we were to think of maybe $10 million out of the reserves, and if we were also thinking that we sold some real estate off and dumped that on, instead of looking at the assessment I hate the word liability when we talk about our cops and our firemen. I would like to think we're paying an assessment in order to have a qualified police and fire. They're not a liability. They're our people, you know. But anyway, needless to say, it would. I think if we keep working at this, next week when we sit here, whatever, we have another graph that shows, okay, now we've planned on maybe selling this piece, and this piece, and here's what happens if that comes in. Then this graph's going to look different. That's my point. And it may not be 10 years, it may be 7. All right? And it may not be 7.5%, it may be 5. But we don't know that yet because we haven't put all the pieces in place.
Councilman Blair.
One thing I think we made it very clear that we do know is at the end of the day, we're still always going to have a debt. Or liability, whatever you want to call it. Who cares? It's still there. But I think the real picture is that people need to be aware of is a one-time infusion of, say, $10 million from the rainy day fund and, say, $3 million from the properties we sell. That's $13 million to bring down the principal. We're still paying on the interest. We still have so many years to pay for it, but it will never be paid off. So if it were 0.75% for 10 years or whenever we deem that it's at a value that it was in 2007 or 2008, I think that's what you need to focus on. And whether it's a combination of what Jim's talking about, we know it's a one-time infusion of money.
That's right.
It's not going to happen every year. And it's a one-time infusion of the values we save by eliminating employees, by eliminating days to the library, by eliminating parks and recreation. Those are one-time infusions. They don't carry on every single year. And by the time you know it, if we do nothing 6 years from now, we have nothing.
That's right.
And that's what that red line shows, is nothing. And we take it out of the hides of our policemen and our firemen and public safety and quality of life in this community.
Councilwoman Orr.
Well, I will just tell you, when I asked Mark to put this together and then he put it together and it looked the way it did, I was smiling. So I just feel it's a positive forecast of what we can think about. And I agree with you, Jim. If there's property we can sell, but at the same time, let's think about it, is that we don't want to have a fire sale either. We want to make sure that what we do, and it takes time, as we see with the PUSD. It took time for PUSD to sell Dexter School. And so, you know, this is it's also a time issue. So I just felt good about the graph. I think it's positive information for our citizens. And thank you, Mark, for taking care of it.
And I agree. I think it gives the citizen an opportunity to see what we have in mind and where we're trying to go. But I just want to make sure that we're as accurate as possible. Councilman Shiska.
Thanks, Mayor. From my personal opinion, I think there are people out there in the city, even outside of the city, who want us to get to a point where we have nothing, who want us to get to a point where we have to nuke the general fund. And I have to tell you, that's not a pretty picture, and that's not somewhere that I'm going to go. And so whatever solution we come up with, it's not going to include that.
Councilman Blair?
Just real quick, I suppose, you know, when we start talking about this property deal, it shows good faith that the council is looking at that.
Absolutely.
I've been jumping up down with Lamerson since prior to Lori Hadley being our assistant city manager with that map in the office and with Greg Lozelle. And we've been talking about this prior to 2006. So here it is 11 years later, and we're finally saying, well, maybe we should do something. Okay, good, I hope we do. Because there's no reason to be sitting on stuff that we don't need to have a liability on. And let's get rid of it. Let's put it towards something that we know we have to do and move on from there. But it's still not going to pay off the whole thing.
Okay, any more questions, comments on this slide? Okay, continue.
All right. With that, we'll get into the whole borrowing option that was briefly discussed at several council meetings in the past, but we'll go into a little more depth with it here. As we start this, I want to clarify, again, we talked a little bit about it, but let's clarify. We're talking about the PSPRS liability. This is an actuarial projection at a point in time of the amount needed in the trust, in the bank, to pay the employees' pensions into the future. It takes into account of a lot of assumptions, earnings rates, the estimated how long employees will live, how long they will work for the city, what their wages will be over their career with the city. A lot of assumptions, not just the earnings, not just the interest rate. So You know, it's a lot more than just that. Because there are so many assumptions, an actuarial evaluation is done every year for determining the new value or the new contribution rates required to achieve the long-term goal, as well as for financial reporting. Now, that's how the liability is created. Now, the unfunded liability is this projected liability minus the money that is sitting in our account, in our trust, in the bank, which is where the interest is earned. With the valuation from June 30 of 2016, the actual projected liability of our two PSPR pensions is $113.9 million. We have in the bank 35.5. That's where we get the 78.445 that is the unfunded liability. And that's what we're talking about, just to kind of frame that whole aspect of it. This section, we're talking about borrowing. Why would you borrow? If you borrow to make a lump sum payment to the PSPRS, what you're essentially doing is you're exchanging this actuarially determined liability for a fixed rate liability. The benefits are if the trust earns more than the cost of that financing, it reduces the cost of paying off this liability. The risk, of course, is if it earns less, which is the same issue with the projections that we talk a lot about, the different assumed projections for long-term rate of return. The risk, of course, goes down the lower the cost of the financing is. Borrowing the money to reduce this unfunded liability will not relieve the city of future liability for differences between actuarial assumptions and actual events. And that, you know, these actuarial valuations go both ways. If you look back at the last 30 years of earnings for the PSPRS, you know, they were at assumed rate of return of 9%, and through the 90s they were making 10%. You know, as we got into 2000 and the stock market started to fluctuate and earnings came down, they started to bring down that long-term look at earnings. And as we've talked about, next year they're going to take it down to 7.4. It's at 7.5 in this actuarial. And borrowing is not a funding mechanism, it's a financing mechanism. So we still have to find a source of funds to repay the loan. Either cuts in the general fund or an alternative revenue source like the 0.75% dedicated tax. Talking to bond counsel and our financial advisor, a loan to pay off PSPRS is not qualified for tax-exempt financing like other municipal properties. So we've talked about different interest rates. This is not tax exempt, so this rate's going to be a little higher. It's going to be closer to 5% than 2%. Again, we talk a lot about the PSPRS investment, so I went ahead and put their allocation chart in here so you can see what PSPRS target allocations are and their actual investments. As you can see, it probably looks a lot like some of your retirement portfolios. You know, 16% U.S. equities, 14% international equities, different credit options, some real estate, various aspects of it. And this comes right from the PSPRS website and the documents they have out there. Looking at the history of this compared to the stock market, you can see other than the issue that was in 2001 when they were heavily, their allocation wasn't like it is now. They were heavily invested in the .com stuff, and when that .com bubble burst, they had some losses over the market there. But other than that, they're pretty close to tracking the Dow Jones average, including the 0.63 that we talk about them earning last fiscal year. That's about what the stock market earned in that fiscal year.
Excuse me, Mark. Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead. So the 7.5, is that a projection this year of what they're going to make over the next how many years?
It's their long-term assumed rate of return. So sitting here today,
so that's an average over into the future of our retirees.
Yes.
Okay.
An alternative to reduce the risk, because you're subject to a lot of market risk when you do a lump sum thing, in a fluctuating earnings environment, which is what we've seen the last 10 years, incremental payments into the bank or the trust of the above our required contributions, and the amount of the debt service is another alternative that we're going to look at in these examples. The benefit to that is you have additional contribution going in, you don't have the cost of the loan, and you aren't subject to the stock market. For the one-time lump sum investments, you're subject to what the market is in the year that you decide to do that investment. So just to clarify, so if you look back and you decided at the beginning of 2001 you were going to invest in the market, in July of 2000 you said we're going to throw $50 million at the PSPRS, well, you're subject to whatever the loss is that year, and you could lose. And that year they had significant losses, like 18% losses that you would have lost of that lump sum. So let me get back to the slide. I'm going the wrong way. They gave me a new clicker today, so I apologize. It's got the buttons in a different order. So by paying these out every year, incremental investments, which we talked about last week, we avoid some of that risk. Yeah, we don't hit all the high ends of the market, but we don't hit all the low ends either. And it's a sound way to invest for your own retirement. It's a sound way to take care of this liability. The risk, of course, is if the interest earnings are consistently above the cost of the borrowing, you will lose out on some benefit of having that upfront payment. So let's look at a couple examples. Talk to RBC Capital Markets, who is the city's financial advisor in debt issuance issues. And a 10-year, $20 million bond is what we looked at. It would have about a 5% coupon if we looked at selling it about 6 months from now. That makes the total cost of that bond with issuance cost about 5.27%. Annual debt service of about $2.7 million. Looking at the actuarial evaluation for 2016, a $20 million lump sum split between our two trusts would reduce our estimated annual required contribution about $1.8 million for the remaining 20-year amortization period of that unfunded liability. So that's 20 years, it would reduce our payment by 1.8. So the additional cost of that financing is $833,000. That's the 2.6 minus the 1.8. And that would be additional cost for that 10-year period of that financing. For the examples, we're going to look at a 10-year period on all these, and we're going to look, for this one, we're looking at the last 10 years, saying the next 10 years are going to be similar to the last 10 years, just for looking at numbers, not making an assumption that that's what it'll be. So the blue line across the middle of the chart is the cost of the borrowing, and the red line, as you saw from the other one, is the actual earnings rate at the PSPRS. So as the earnings rate is below that blue line, we have a negative impact costing the city more. As it's above, we have positive costing the city less. So it's the net of those two things. Looking at these cost options out there, we'll plot our blue line, which is our cost of the borrowing. That's the $2.6 million for 10 years. That's $26 million over the life of this loan that we'll have to pay. The lump sum that we invested at the beginning of year one, you can see it fluctuates, it goes up, it actually goes below 20 million in the third year because of market losses, and then it moves its way up. Ends up being worth about 30.1 million at the end of this. Now, that incremental investment that I was talking about, if we took that 2.6 each year and sent it to PSPRS incrementally over the 10 years, the overall cost, looking at the earnings rate, would be almost 35 million. So again, that's how we minimize the risk from those down rate years. So I took another example.
Excuse me, Mark.
Yes.
Mayor? So it would almost be like if I, instead of investing a lump sum in the market today, I put it in a mutual fund, and it didn't experience the highs and didn't experience the lows, but it was catching the averages.
Right, more of a dollar cost averaging, the same way you should be saving for your retirement, is just incremental investments over time, not big lumps at one time, lump sum payments.
Thank you, Mayor.
On our second example, I moved the year 1 year because we had a lot of fluctuations in those years. And if you move from a 2008 to a projected 2017 earnings rates from PSPRS, there's a significant change. Again, it's just an example to show the if I go the right way. As you can see, a lot more negative on this graph because we have those 2 first years that were very negative. Then we have some positive and negatives. As we look at the results, again, same 3 lines, the cost of borrowing, the lump sum ends up being just a little bit more than the straight dollars of the cost of borrowing over this time period. But again, that incremental investment performs at 35 million. So I went ahead and did a third example because I know everybody loves examples of investment options. So this one is related to an internal loan because the council talked about this last week. So in this one, we're doing an internal loan for $20 million for a 10-year period at a 0% interest rate. Again, bringing it up as an example, not as a suggestion or as good public policy. I'm just bringing it up as an example to look at. That would be $2 million a year, obviously 10 payments of $2 million to repay whatever fund it is, the water fund, let's say, the $20 million that was borrowed. Again, it'll reduce our payment for 20 years by $1.8 million. The additional cost, of course, would be $200,000, $2 million minus 1.8. And again, we're using that 08 to 17 projection for interest earnings to evaluate this one. As we talked about, with a lower interest rate, this performs better because your interest rate is lower, you got more green bars, you're earning more above the line. So we throw the lines on there, and again, the $20 million, $2 million a year, we have an incremental investment of $2 million a year. And then we have the lump sum. As you can see, lump sum actually did a little better in this one because the earnings rate was so low, but it's real similar to just what the incremental payment of that $20 million. And one problem with this graph is it doesn't show the hidden cost of this type of arrangement, which is the water fund having to borrow money to build infrastructure projects that $20 million was earmarked for. So even though it's not shown on this graph, there's an additional cost of 3% or 4%, depending on the markets, in the water fund, and that goes to our water users. So just to summarize, paying down the actuarial liability, again, although it will reduce our unfunded liability, it does not relieve us from future liability from fluctuations in the actuarial assumptions, whether it's positive or negative. And again, when you get close to having this paid off, some years you're going to be overfunded like you saw when you looked in the past of where we were. And some years it'll go back to underfunded depending on how those valuations change. Still need to find a funding source. Remember, this is a financing means. This isn't a funding means. The benefit, of course, earnings more than the pool. It costs us less, earnings less, it costs you more. That risk is lower the lower the rate is. And the incremental additional payments is a good option to borrowing. It helps alleviate some of that risk to the market. You got to just think what you think the stock market will do for the next 10 years, whether it's better to play it safe or where you can get funding.
Mark, one of the other advantages of the incremental chunk payments is it gives you the ability on a year-to-year basis to manage your own cash flow and to see where we are. Is that correct?
Absolutely. You can do it from the operating budgets. You can do it from reserves, depending on how last year came out with revenues to budget. You can say, well, we were $1 million better last year. Let's add that. It's something the council can consider and can allocate each budget cycle, which is a good thing. It helps you meet the other needs. I mean, we talk a lot about PSPRS, but there's a lot of other needs to manage the city, maintaining adequate public safety fleet and being able to pursue economic development opportunities. So it allows that flexibility as you go through time.
Councilwoman Orr?
But Mark, we still need a consistent revenue source.
Absolutely. I mean, the lump sum payments and individual payments, those are all good things to help bring it down. But with the city of Prescott in this position that it's in, you know, we need additional funding to help take care of this $78-80 million unfunded liability to get it down. You're not going to do it by putting $2 million more in it each year. That's going to help, and we should definitely do that. We should look at that, but it's not going to get you all the way there.
Thank you.
With that, I will turn it over to Don Hirsch to talk about city-owned real estate, unless there's any questions you want to cover on borrowing at this point. It's totally clear, huh?
I do have one question or comment.
Sure.
Back on the tax exempt, non-tax exempt borrowing,
Yes.
you said there it costs more if it's a non-tax exempt.
Absolutely.
Okay. It seems to me it would also be a lot less attractive to investors if it's not tax exempt.
It's definitely not. I wouldn't say it's not as attractive to investors, but it is definitely a different group of investors. Tax-exempt funds generally attract a certain group of investors. So you're not going to be selling the tax-exempt bonds to the same people you sell taxable bonds to. It's just two different groups, two different markets. There's a lot to it, but essentially, yes.
Okay. But your main point was it would cost.
It's going to cost
more,
the city more.
The city more. Right?
Yes.
And Mark, just one other thing about borrowing from ourselves from the other funds. If we have a CIP that might not be realistic, or the projects might not be in the hopper as soon as we thought there were, there's less risk with that because they probably were not going to come to fruition in the time frame anyway. Is that a
Depending on how long that time frame is stretched, obviously. We're talking about a 10-year period here.
One more comment.
Sure.
I would encourage all of council members to look at last year's budget and the capital improvement list, which is lengthy and goes way out into the future. And the city has a plan for each aspect of our infrastructure that we are going to have to pay for in the future. So internal borrowing, like you said, has a hidden cost. We're going to have to find money for those capital projects from an outside source.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to consider before you pursue interest-free internal loans, for sure.
Any other questions, comments on borrowing before we move on to land or property? Okay.
Afternoon, Mayor, Council. I'm going to do a little presentation. We did a presentation similar to this last January in 2016. It lasted a couple hours, I think, on that particular one. Then Mayor invited me to give a presentation also on a television show. The early part of last year, we did like a half-hour show on real property and how it related to PSPRS. So it's going to be kind of an update on where we were from last year, some things that moved forward, and some recommendations and so forth on the different properties. So if I can figure out his buttons that he's got on here. I'm going to start off real simple. We get a lot of questions from the public, and I think these are probably real good to start off with. Some common questions are, during discussion with the PSPRS unfunded liability, one of the questions that comes up is, doesn't the city have land or other assets that could sell to cover these costs? And that's a great question to start off with. So everyone know that putting this in perspective with the PSPRS unfunded liability, if a city property is sold historically, the fund that the property was purchased from is the fund where the proceeds were returned to. Therefore, the funds did not originally come from the general fund. It has not gone to the general fund, which wouldn't have an effect on the PSPRS. And that was historically how it had been done. Another question we get a lot is the city owns property for various reasons, and what are the uses, and why does the city own them? It all comes down to a lot of the infrastructure. As a municipality, the city has many different services, supplying water and sewer, roadways, recreation, open space, fire, and police services. And all of these different things require real property for buildings and infrastructure. The police department needs administrative buildings. The fire department needs fire stations. You need to have roads for ease of transportation, city parks, open space for recreation, city administrative buildings for government services. These are just some of the examples that everybody knows about and you see and you touch and feel. But there's a lot of the city stuff that people don't see, and those are probably the properties we're going to be talking a lot about today.
Don, I got a question here.
Yeah.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you, Mayor. My question's for the city attorney. Clarification on the point. Is there a mechanism under state statutes in which if we were to sell a property that was purchased out of one fund, that we can channel it back through the process into the general fund so that it could be directed to pay on PRS?
I think you'd have an accounting problem with it, because it would have to be, if the funds used to purchase the property came out of the water enterprise fund, then typically those monies go back to that water fund. So there would be a second step to the process, which would be then to transfer those monies to the general fund to use for whatever purpose. And so every property that isn't a general fund property would be its own unique analysis, because the question would have to be answered: with what funds or did you use to acquire property for the water fund, or the sewer use, or those kinds of things. And so it would either have to be essentially a grant or a transfer of monies from one of those enterprise funds to the general fund. It's doable. It's legally, I think, doable. But you're going to have that. It's really no different than taking money out of the let's say the water fund had, as I recall, $29 million in cash on hand. Sort of, I think it's referred to as reserve. It would be like taking part of that cash and moving to the general fund.
I appreciate your comment that it is legally doable,
It's doable, yeah.
and it is a policy issue.
It is.
And, I don't want to sound trite, but it's very similar to when Pearl Harbor was bombed. The cooks grabbed their rifles too. It wasn't just the guys that were trained riflemen that were out there shooting at airplanes. You know what I mean?
The only sort of legal limitations are properties that may have been purchased by way of, say, a bond issuance. Those may have to go back to not violate the terms of that debt service, for instance. So if land were purchased with cash on hand that wasn't from a borrowing, from a bond, for instance, then it would be doable. But we'd have to look at with what funding or what was the funding used to acquire that land. And if it were, say, a debt type service or a bond, we would have to look at those documents to make sure to see whether or not that could go to the general fund or would have to go back to whichever enterprise fund did the borrowing.
Thank you. And, at some point as we move through the process, those are some of the nuts and bolts that we have to get to, because the whole community's at risk here with regards to the liability, for the lack of a better word. The community's in liability right now. And it's the community that needs to be out of the liability, and we need to look at all of the options, not just limit our focus as to what's the low-hanging fruit and what we could get to easy.
In one, again, depending on the nuances and the particulars of the property, it would be similar to building into your rate structure a portion of water and sewer rates that would get transferred every year to the general fund to provide some sort of general fund service. If you were to sell a property that was purchased with rates, and generally that's how we purchase property for those enterprise funds, are with the rates and fees we charge to people for water or sewer use. So, essentially those rates would then effectively be being used to subsidize the general fund and then to pay off PSPRS. So you would still be using ratepayers to subsidize or to pay off the PSPRS debt. It's just in a multi-step process rather than just transferring cash from this account to that account.
And I thought that's where we came up with the internal loan thought process, was the fact that you would actually be borrowing by the general fund from the water fund, that it was going to be paid back, but we could do the loan at no interest. So there's things that can be done. All right, it's not something that you think about in 20 seconds, say that's the way we're going to go.
It's doable, though.
All of these are policy decisions that you guys have the discretion to make.
Thank you. I just heard from the attorney what I thought I heard before. It's doable.
Doable.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay, just kind of moving along with our questions. Out in Chino Valley, the city has purchased a lot of property for water rights. That's almost everything we have out in Chino Valley. And we need that so that we can actually pump the water out of the ground. And from that, we need to be able to put it into pipes and bring it all the way to the city of Prescott. And to do that, it's another reason we have lots of different pieces of property for pump stations and facilities to actually move the water to the city of Prescott. That's a big part of it. We also have a lot of properties for just the opposite purpose, for taking that wastewater from the homes and businesses and bringing it out to our wastewater treatment plant out by the airport. And again, you need lots of these little properties that you see around town. Most people don't recognize them, just little bitty buildings, stuff, and there's where we have our pump stations and things on them. Another question we get, I just picked out like 3 of the top questions we get a lot. Seems to be very few city properties not currently used for the original intended purpose. And what they want to know why. Well, back in the 1990s, the city went through a process very similar to what we're doing now, to figure out all the properties that could possibly be sold that weren't being used for the original purpose in the previous 100 years. And they sold them all off and used those funds, and they put a majority of it into the city's capital improvement special revenue fund and used that for things like the library expansion and the downtown parking garage and the new adult center. So that kind of brings us to where we are today. Put together a list of some properties that the staff, as we've looked at all the different properties, to figure out which ones we thought would probably be sellable in the next 6 months. And these are ones that staff would definitely recommend for sale. Wildland Fire Station number 7 on 6th Street was purchased with general funds. That's about a 1.3 acre parcel off of 6th Street where the hotshot crew was at one time. Now there's still a small contingent of fire department personnel there, which there are some facilities where they could be relocated to, so we could sell that particular parcel. That'd be a nice commercial parcel. There's actually 3 of them there, but it would probably be best to be sold in like two different parcels. The ones are really small, which you really need access for the other one that's to the north there. And you can always ask me questions anytime while I'm going through these.
I have a question, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, go ahead.
On that slide there, if you go to up Easy Street, past it, so we're going
Up here?
on that map north, I guess it would.
Okay.
There is a well station, a community where they fill up water tanks.
Okay.
All right, and there is a yard where we store stuff.
Are you talking in this, if you can see the pointer I have on the other screen up front? You're talking in this area right here?
Yep. Do we own that?
We do. We own a couple parcels in there. Just trying to look here, it comes in through here. We own that little bitty rectangle there, and I believe it's this parcel right up in there also.
And do we own where the little cars are to the north of there?
And that I do
That
not.
thin little swatch that you just pointed at?
Oh, one right here?
Yeah.
I'm not positive.
No, and we own, of course, that all provides access to the back of the Virginia Street
Yeah.
complex, which is that big building you see.
Right.
Yeah, this one here.
And the buildings around it.
Yeah, we own this building right here, but we own a couple of those parcels right there, which are actually used. And there may be some future uses which we've been discussing for access across this parcel.
Okay. Thank you.
Another parcel we have, there's actually 2 of them on the south of Larkin. Currently, the buildings directly to the east of it are the Boys and Girls Club. They have the parking lot, which is to the south of them. There's a really steep hill to the south of that, and we also own that area. The parking lot that's behind them, they do use that for parking occasionally when they need it. They've recently just built a basketball court on the back of their parking lot, which has limited it a little bit more, and they have been using this one. This one also is vacant, which would probably be a really good parcel. These are all zoned multifamily, medium density. There's a lot of like 4plexes and 3plexes and duplexes in this area of town right here. So that would be a very sellable parcel. And they're about 0.6 acres total, so it's about a little over a third of an acre each one.
And just And just, Mayor, if I can interrupt or interject, the charter does allow the city to subdivide parcels and sell off those subdivided parcels. So if you look at the Boys and Girls Club parcel as one big parcel, the city could sell off the southern, whatever that is, half for a house or, you know, 2 resident. Again, it's steep, but that doesn't stop anybody. And you get a view. With steep property, you get a view, so that's the trade-off. But I mean, in other words, maintaining the Boys and Girls Club in that current location and what that provides to the community can be continued if that parcel were essentially cut in 55%, half roughly. So that's an option for the city.
And just to clarify, yes, we do own this parcel, and I believe we own these 2 as well, but those are all Acker Trust lands. So
Not the Boys and Girls Club, though.
the Boys and Girls Club, this whole thing is Acker Trust land.
Is it, then it's not sellable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, this parcel over here would definitely be something that the staff would recommend selling. It'd probably be a fairly easy sell, actually, for the city if we were looking to do so. Another small parcel we have is just a quarter-acre parcel. It's off of Tank Road, which is near the west end of Copper Basin Road. We had a water tank on there one time that has been since removed. When the subdivision was platted, the part that's right here up to that, so I can steady this thing down here, this little line right there, was platted to the city as part of it for a water tank. Subsequently, while we were doing construction, where the city acquired these extra 2 little pieces here as the site grew slightly from this property owner. So the property is now, I think it's about 40 feet by 60 feet. It's not that large of a parcel, but one of the neighbors has actually expressed interest in acquiring that property from the city if we ever do want to sell that. And it's a little flat little parcel. Actually, the access to it is up this shared driveway to it. So really the only use for it would probably be one of these property owners or combination of those 3 property owners.
Now that says water fund.
And that's water fund. Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have pointed that out. On the top of these properties, I also have on there what fund they were purchased from. So as a good reference, the South Water. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. Oh, yeah. This thing's like backwards, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, yeah, at the top it has like the funds that they would have came from. The South Water Reservoir tank, that's another one we have. It's about 2 1/4 acres. The water tank itself is about 1 acre in size. Has a corrugated metal roof on it. We've abandoned that. ADAQ didn't no longer would certify it, and we built a new tank site off to the east years ago. Currently, the city has to actually maintain the grounds around there, keep fire hazards down and all that kind of stuff, and keep people out. People like going in there and prying up the metal roof and crawling down inside that empty tank and doing whatever they do. So we have a liability on it. It would be a good one for the city to get rid of. The topography is actually from here to the north very, very steep, as well as it is down to the west and to the east. But it is a beautiful site. It's got about 270 degrees views of the city. An amazing location. The problem, of course, is that tank site there, 1 acre in size, about 20 feet deep, would take quite a feat to engineer something over the top of it or to fill it. But something we've, as staff, have been looking at. We're actually doing some water detention basins to the east.
Right over
And from the off-fill that we need to haul away from that, it's a really close location. We're kind of looking at the cost of doing it, as far as what we would save from hauling it off to other sites, or to actually bring that fill and engineer and fill that thing in lifts. Of course, you'd have to bust the bottom of the tank out first to perforate it so it would percolate. But we could actually possibly fill that up. And now you'd have a 1 acre flat level building site to build a structure on. That would be a valuable piece of property to sell.
Don, before you fill that in, I think you might want to put it up for sale as is, because I went up there and looked at it. And it seems to me the area that's down below ground would make a nice parking area if you had a 3-unit condo that was designed so that it's not obstructing the view of the houses on Palmer Place. Parking underground, you know, it might be an engineering feat once again to make it strong enough, but I would consider it offering for sale as is.
Oh, yeah.
I
that's-
agree with you,
that's-
just put it out there, see if somebody's, because
Those are both the two options we've looked at. The second option I was talking about filling it, that's something we just started talking about in the last week because we just have a lot of extra fill we need to remove. Certainly somebody could probably come in and have some engineer put some huge steel girders across there and build a structure on there and have a 40-car submerged garage for the elevator for their cars in if they wanted to. But it is a piece of property that is definitely a sellable property. The following properties are actually currently leased. We could put them up for sale, but they are currently leased. If somebody's going to buy them, they'd have to be aware that they are leased. One is next to Humane Society. The Humane Society actually owns their property right here where their buildings are at. That's their property. And they also have this property here for the dog pound, I believe it is, which they're leasing that building and land from us for like, I believe, $1 a year currently. This parcel is just a portion of a much larger parcel, which actually encompasses the area to the northwest and also to the west, which includes part of our waste pond over here. This area here is something that could be sold. It's about 12-acre parcel. It's a fairly steep topography going up, but that is something that could be, or a portion thereof.
And Don, if we clarify, I'm not sure where the, I guess from left to right, we're only leasing that portion of the developed property.
This little piece right here?
Yeah.
Yes, just this little piece we're leasing to them for $1.
Right, so the rest of that.
The rest of it's all just vacant, unused, just sitting there ground. And it is off of Pioneer Parkway, off of Sundog Road.
So what we could do to be a good partner with our Humane Society, we could draw a little line there, maintain that, do a parcel split, and put the rest of it up for sale.
Absolutely. There's a lot, we could do that on a lot of these parcels, and as we go through them, you'll see that too. There's a lot of these parcels when the city had purchased them, like this particular one, we had to buy the whole parcel. Most property owners don't want to sell the city a piece of it, so we have to buy the whole thing. Well, Pioneer Parkway did not exist back then, so that's why it's all split up now. I mean, it was just open land at that point in time. So, but a lot of these properties you're going to see that as a case.
Don, what's the topo like on that? Is it a pretty big?
It's really steep. I mean, that's a 150-foot climb there probably. That's a pretty good hill.
One thing that, if I can, Mayor, that, while we're thinking about all this wonderful stuff to sell, that property over on 6th Street is worth a lot of money. It's in commercial zone. It stores
Correct.
vehicles that we're not using any longer. When this plant becomes inactive or more likely inactive, that becomes a city piece of property that would be a great storage facility where we could liquidate the property that's more valuable on 6th Street. So all I'm saying is there's trade-offs that we need to look at too here instead of just looking at a parcel.
Oh, absolutely. Another parcel that we have is way south of town. Here's Goldwater Lake up here, by the way. So this is south of Goldwater Lake. Friendly Pines Camp actually leases that space. There's about 94 acres that they lease from us down here. And they've been leasing that from us, wow, I think since like the 50s. It's been a long time. We just currently the city just did a new lease with them, which goes through 2023, 2 years ago, on that property. We get about $16,000 a year on rent on that particular parcel. Could somebody buy it? Could Friendly Pines buy it? Absolutely. It was originally purchased with the water funds, as a lot of the properties were because of for water sources back in the day. But we're not using that for that at this time, and it's not projected to be either. Then we come down to some properties that have wells on it and for water facilities and things like that, where we end up having to buy, as I mentioned earlier, the entire parcels, but we only need a smaller portion of them, which could possibly put up for sale a part of them. Well site number 1 in Chino Valley is one of those parcels. Currently, we have one water tank on there and some other facilities. We're getting ready in the construction stages now, or construction plans. We're building another water tank just to the east of it. And eventually we'll have a pump station on this property also in this area, and some more parking for that facility as we expand this facility. CVID owns this parcel here, and that's their building. After looking at it, there's a possibility. We also have a well right in this area on the very northern portion of the property. So if we did sell something off, we'd have to make sure we have wellhead protection for that. But in looking at it with staff, we estimated we could probably sell 5 or 6 acres off with Highway 89 frontage and Road 1 North also access in that green shaded area. The city, when we do the parking and stuff like that, at some point we would probably build our entrance into the property for our uses stuff. Most logical would probably be lining off of the telephone road directly to the east. So that might also give us some access into that parcel. But that'd be a really good commercial property with highway frontage and secondary access off of Road 1 North for people could make a make a left-hand turn. So that'd be a valuable piece to sell. Sorry, I've been fighting a cold. Oh, thanks.
I just had one drink out of it.
It's okay. Well site number 3 in Chino Valley. This particular property, we have facilities down in the very southern portion of it around Road 2 North. It's a possibility we could sell the northern half of that parcel. Also, as you can see, it's a lot of residential around here, so that might be a good place for another subdivision and so forth.
That's a school right above it right there.
Mm-hmm. So that'd be another possibility of selling about 20 acres off on that property. And then we get down to some other properties we get questions about a lot, but really to take a lot of thought to if we want to sell them or not. We have some properties surrounding the Dugan Wells. It's all the way out in Paulden. Everybody has the opinion, we could just sell off almost all this land that we have out there, and there are some pieces we could sell. Some of them we'll have to talk about because they have a lot of water rights attached to them, and that's the reason we purchased them. This particular parcel, it has 3 historic wells on it from when we actually purchased it. It has water rights as part of that entire parcel also, which are attached to this. So if you end up selling them off, you may end up even selling off your water, and that's not necessarily the best thing to do.
Is that area, the residents that live around there, they've got their own well?
People around there have
There's
their
not
own
a water
wells.
service there?
No, there's nothing around here. And as you can see, almost all of it is still just bare land. There's hardly any buildings and structures or anything in this area. That land doesn't have a lot of actual value.
Like up there at Arrowhead Drive and Venice Way there.
Yeah, up in this area there are
Those are all
subdivisions.
individual wells in those properties?
I'm not sure. Greg, do you know the answer to that question?
There are some small community water systems in that area.
So, I'm just throwing this out here, could we put conditions on it to where if we were to sell that, they would have to do something like that, where you couldn't just put a straw on the ground and everybody get their own well.
Yeah.
But we could put conditions on how that water is used.
Yeah, and we'd have to maintain some places like with those 3 little things that you see on there, and also over on this property here. I'm not sure exactly where it is. I think it's split down this area. There's actually a monitoring well, which is part of our comprehensive agreement number 1, and we have to maintain that for another at least 5 years, I believe. So that area down here, we'd have to maintain these couple of little spots through here, but they do have water rights attached to them, so that's something we definitely have to be very cognizant of if we're ever looking at selling anything out there. Then I'm just going to go to a blanket chart. There's a lot of properties that we have out in Big Chino. We have the Big Chino Water Ranch. It's way out Big Chino Road, about 20 miles out, which the city purchased for the water rights. That's all those in the purple up on top. Then the ones that are down below, those are all tied to the Del Rio Springs area. Around the Del Rio Springs, we actually purchased the original parcel back there in 1900. The city's forefathers were really thinking ahead of time. And from, a lot of people don't realize, but from 1900 to like 1934, the city of Prescott got their water from there. We had a water line that ran from there to the city of Prescott, and that's a long way. Since then, it's been pretty dilapidated over the years. We stopped using it for a long time, gave some CBID some water uses from this, stuff like that. But the ones that are on the bottom down there, the permit that we were given by the state for the water, when we did the purchase and got the permit for actually using the water for that, was for 900 million gallons a year that we could withdraw from there. To give you an idea how much water that is, the city used about 2.2 billion last year. So it's almost half of our water supply could be tied up in that bottom four down in there. We're not currently using that, right? Yeah, we're not currently drawing any water from there. Also, so
can we improve that pipe that's there?
The pipe that's still, just so you know, I actually went down to the Bureau of Land Management last year, checking on the permit that we had for that, and it is still a viable, active permit for a water line from Del Rio Spring to the south water tank here in Prescott, which is on South Mineral we're talking about. That's still a viable permit that we have that's active today, that we could have a permit, according to them, through their stuff, we could actually still have a water line in that location. Is it practical? The city hasn't done anything with it in about 70 years. The line itself is here in pieces. Since then, a lot of property owners have built over it and stuff like that through all those years too. But it just so you know, it is still active.
And that's a water discussion. But
yes.
Could we, for revenue sources, could we lease the land to cattle or to anything for people that wouldn't like build anything?
Possibly. Grazing rights right now, $25 per year per animal unit, and that's one cow and one calf, or one horse, or 4 sheep, to give you an idea. So it's not a lot of money.
Okay.
And you can't graze a lot of them because there's not that much grazing on each one. So the dollar amount for the grazing is very, very minimal.
But it's something.
It's something. It is something, but it is very minimal. There's actually been a request recently from a ranch owner out there to be able to do some grazing of his cattle to our property just north of Sullivan Lake. They own the property where Sullivan Lake is actually at, and to the south from there, that's Del Rio Ranch. And they were asking about the grazing on the property to the north. But again, there's a minimal amount of grazing that you can do per acre with the terrain and the grasses that are out there. So the revenue is very, very minimal. Yep, probably the amount of time it takes for staff to take care of it every year and everything else, it'd probably be a wash. So probably like net zero.
Yeah, we got a question from Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. How long you been here now, Don?
3.5 years.
You moved here from where?
Well, actually, I've been in the city of Prescott for 22 years, but I've been with the city for 3.5.
Yeah. I find it peculiar to even talk about sheep.
Sheep.
You know?
Hey, there's things, as a real property specialist, there's the amount of hats you have to wear is pretty tremendous.
Well, just keep in mind, we're in cattle country here. Okay?
Well, I understand that, but that's part of grazing rights. That is something that you need to be able to understand, I guess.
Mayor?
Go ahead.
I still think that, there are those opportunities like at the Big Chino Water Ranch, all the land's above it, to go out for RFQ to Hickman's Egg Ranch and have a chicken farm or something out there. I mean, we have never done that. We don't know whether there's anybody out there that would be likely to want to lease it for long term. To me, it's worth asking the question because it becomes a revenue stream for the city.
Absolutely. And I just opened up another slide here. And this one's like the overall map of all of our city properties. And the Big Chino Water Ranch is, I have it as an insert in the very top center. For this to be a good map for us to have discussions if there's any of the properties you could think of and stuff. But I've had a few people recently inquire about possibly doing some grazing up here and there's different things. It's actually very fairly fertile up there. There's a wash that runs down through there. Again, it is about I was out there about a month ago. It's about 20 miles west of the highway, Big Chino Road. It's pretty far out there.
Steve knows. We grew up out there, and his
There you go.
father-in-law
So he
ran
knows
that
well.
ranch.
Yeah, and so
It had probably thousands of head of cattle on
yeah,
it.
well, it'd be an amazing piece of property for that use. I guess the biggest thing was just trying to figure out different things we could do with that property. That's probably the biggest one that we could do that with. Again, there's some other small ones that we might be able to do a little grazing with in North Chino, but again, that'd probably be with people that are running cattle adjacent to it, because there's not large enough places to bring in thousands of cattle.
Don, I just wanted to dovetail on what Councilman Blair said, that Blair is the guy over there, that as we're trying to convince the public and show the public that we're doing everything possible, putting out an RFQ for that makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely, absolutely it does. And I've actually had a person from the Tucson area, well, I might say south of Tucson in Arizona, down in Patagonia area, asking about cattle up in that area up there. There's just different things we could do with those. Again, they're not short term, but in the long term, we could probably do some things with some of those. It takes a lot longer to make those kinds of things happen. Any other questions from council?
Yeah, I have a question. Did you ever ballpark what all of this would mean to the city if, in fact, we sold these properties that you've talked about?
Yeah.
Councilman Shishko, just for the ability to negotiate with potential purchasers, maybe just have that conversation offline with him.
Sure.
We talked a little bit about giving you a ballpark, but it almost makes more sense not to play our cards that openly.
I can understand that. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
I don't know, Mayor, if, this is, again, us sitting up here talking about some long-term things and real-term reality things, but, long-term, we purchased all those properties around Watson and Willow Lake. It's a prime area to do private-public partnership with the city as far as recreational opportunities that we could do RFQ and RFPs for as well, so.
Councilman, I can actually speak to that. I spoke with Joe Baines about those properties actually this morning, about another conversation we had on it. Currently, like if we wanted to do, let's just say as an example, maybe like a campground or something like that in this area, or maybe you could do another one over here or whatever. As with the BLM, with the permit that we have for those properties and so forth, if the city did it by themselves, it's acceptable. But if you bring in a third entity, it's forbidden. That's something that the BLMs may in the future change their regulations, but that's the way the regulations are currently, so we couldn't do it.
All those properties aren't BLM. There's a lot of privately owned properties around those lakes.
Oh, absolutely.
That we bought privately owned properties.
Right, I'm just mentioning the ones that were the BLM ones that are around the park.
Okay, so we go in the business of providing hookups for motorhomes and RVs, and we put the money in the general fund. There's ways to look at things.
Absolutely, and I actually have that on my notes as something that we have considered. The problem, I guess, again, it's a funding thing, I guess. We'd have to put the money up front to build the infrastructure to get the return to put back into the general fund. I guess that's where we're kind of at on that at this moment.
Any other questions, comments on this briefing?
I have a comment, Mayor. So, Mr. City Manager, concerning these properties, the ones that you're recommending that we go forward on, what's next?
The city attorney and I talked a little bit about that. What's the process that would give us the most bang for the buck and is also legal?
That would be
Oh,
good.
that's good.
Yeah.
Sort of the goal,
Well,
right?
the legal process, selling a piece of real estate, unless it has a restriction, like in the charter, there are some restrictions, like about Willow and Watson Lake and other parcels, but it's basically you sell to the highest bidder. Simple. The council would, the council would have to approve the final sale or the final purchase at a meeting, with with council direction, either at this meeting or another public meeting, staff could go out and list, those properties that council wants to give direction on as far as for sale, and just put them out on the market, whether probably hire a real estate broker to just put them for sale. Technically, it's just, you post it on, you advertise it one time and sell it to the highest bidder, but obviously in the practical world, that's not, that's the minimum legal requirement, but the practical would be, hire a broker and
Maximize our.
sell it for the highest purchase price, so that broker is going to help you determine, you don't have to get an appraisal. Oftentimes selling a piece of property, a broker is going to come in and say, this is what the property I think is worth, let's list it at that, and then let the negotiation begin. I agree with the idea that if we're going to talk about particular parcels and particular dollar numbers, we should do that in executive session, so as to not show our hand. However, that being said, once you hire the broker and you list the price, everybody knows what the asking price is.
Any other questions, comments?
Well, I think, based upon what I've seen, I'd like to see an executive session and get more into depth about the ones that we could liquidate sooner than later, like the one in Chino Valley on the highway frontage. It may be a good time to do that.
Sixth
The
Street.
properties on 6th Street and those types of things. So I'd like to have that conversation.
And I would also recommend that both for properties in the city, in the county, and in Chino, in the town, that we know a little bit more detail about what the zoning is and what the possible uses or restrictions are, so you can kind of give you a better idea of, if someone were to buy it, what they can do with it, or whether they have to go through a process of rezoning and those kinds of things to do something different. So probably want to bring that information to whatever exec session as well.
And I was just talking to Don. He thinks he could have that information to you if you wanted to proceed with having the executive next Tuesday.
Okay, we'll take a look at it. I think we got one subject. I don't know how long that'll take.
It shouldn't take too long.
Okay. Yeah, we might look at trying to double up
Yeah.
next week. Okay. Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you. I'd also like to, prior to next Tuesday, get a little info on the opportunities in the Big Chino.
Okay.
We own thousands of acres out there.
In terms of sale or leasing, Mayor Pro Tem, sale would be very difficult. I think.
The word they used was opportunities.
I think leasing is a good opportunity.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. We could talk about looking at putting an RFQ together.
Okay, any other questions, comments? I want to thank you, City Manager, for putting this briefing together. I think, I know it's a lot of work and a lot of thought had to go into that. So I
appreciate
think at
that,
this
Mayor.
point, we'll go out to the public. If they have any thoughts or questions, then come on down. Try and limit yourself to 5 minutes. I'll give you a 30-second warning.
Hi, my name is Ed Wolf, Prescott resident. Just a couple of quick questions. I wanted to ask, are on page 4 of this presentation, are the COLA increases included in this chart on page 4?
Which COLA increases are you referring to, sir?
Well, on the PSPRS, there are COLA
The
increases.
PBIs, the pension benefit increases?
Right, yeah.
Yes, they are part of the actuarial assumptions. All these projections were made based on the last actuarial valuation, which does include those.
Okay. Question 2 was, with the influx of more new housing and business, is the general tax base being increased so that more money, more revenue is coming into the town?
Assumptions were made on the growth of taxable activity in the city for the revenue coming from the 0.75% sales tax.
Okay, and the third and last question is, does the federal government manage any land that Prescott could get back and use that for resale? I know that west of the Mississippi River, the government owns like 75 and 80% of the land masses in all the different states. So I'm just wondering if Prescott has any interest in that, or any kind of deals going on with the feds or anything that we can recoup some of that land for resale.
I don't believe we do. I mean, I'm going to defer to the people that have been here longer than I have.
I can tell you, we don't have any current I mean, we talked about, as you recall, near Goldwater Lake, acquiring some land with open space funds for, expanding Goldwater Lake. The practical, as sort of idealistic as that sounds in terms of taking land from the federal government and making it, sort of local, the practical reality is it just doesn't happen. I mean, the Forest Service has millions of acres around here, and they're not likely to give any of it up to the city of Prescott especially for sale to private, commercial or residential type development. So, the BLM, as we heard, has land. There's probably be a reclamation land, but those lands are very difficult to come by to acquire from the federal government, even with, even as another government entity. I mean, you look at state trust land. If we were to acquire state trust land for any reason, we basically have to pay, highest, best use value for that property. The state won't give away that trust land to us for any reason. Federal government's, even more difficult to work with.
Mr. Palladini, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we do get payment in lieu of tax funding from federal lands. It's appropriated by the Congress down to the states, I believe, and then the states make distribution on that. But I think it's for rural schools.
Yeah, it's to the county. There is some contribution from the feds for federal land, but it's a county funding source, not a city funding source.
And just as sort of as a related point, there are often every year bills in the legislature that are sort of always trying to ratchet back what the city's able to do with or with its property in terms of selling it off or acquiring. This year, it's the big deal about conservation easements and wanting the city to pay, an in lieu of fee. So, the sort of practical reality of all this is the properties that were shown today are the properties we own, and we can do with those what we need to do, subject to whatever limitations may exist on those properties.
Okay.
The reason for that question was that the federal government, the BLM and the Forest Service and all of that, have used the EPA to say that we can manage the land better than you can. And they don't own it. They manage it. So the states still own that land. And there's a group out there that is trying to get back a lot of the land in all the western states. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next. Hello.
Hi, I took some notes, so I'm going to just try and read through them so I don't forget anything. My name is Deborah Fingston, and obviously my son was Andrew Ashcraft, part of the Granite Mountain Hotshots, and so I'm really interested in just discussing the property on 6th Street, Station 7. I understand that selling the property is, it's important. But it's also important to a lot of people within the community, not just the families, but to us. And I understand also being able to split the property. If you look at the property, it would be very easy to split. And as stated, you are able to do that. So it could really be split into 2 properties. So I'm more interested in the front half that contains the, that holds the station, Station 7 itself. Yes, it is commercial, so I understand the value of being in a commercial as opposed to just being out somewhere, even though my driveway is extremely steep, so I don't think really elevation matters. It's great for sledding when you're looking at other properties. But I want to ask for the opportunity for the families and those that care about Station 7 to maybe have some possible time. I just heard about this over the weekend, and I think it would be fantastic if you would give us some time to maybe look outside of the box and to see what we could use this property for, to restart bringing funding back into the community as that station used to do prior to the tragedy, that station could make the city money continually and not just in one sale. I would like to ask that you give us time to possibly look at working with the police department, the Prescott Fire Department, the Wildland Firefighter Guardian Institute, the Eric Marsh Foundation. Northern Arizona University has been working with the WFGI, the Wildland Firefighter Guardian Institute, to possibly bring in a school of wildland fire in the Prescott Valley area. Why not? Let's look at Prescott and maybe that location as a place to run it. To work with a state forester, because they are looking working. They are in desperate need of trained wildland firefighters, especially in incident command. Let's let Prescott be a positive provider of those that are needed. So working with the state forester, obviously working with Powwick would be interesting, and the Prescott Department Fire Union. Let's reactivate that property and use it. And that way it can be an income source and not just a one-time sale. With that, we could bring in families, we could bring in people that would buy and help the sales tax, which we seem to live off of now. I'm just asking for time to let us pull a committee together to come and present to you some options that could be available at Station 7 and 6th Street. Possibly pull out some of the items that we have at 312 McCormick and bring it through. But I'm just asking for time, and I would also like to defer to Amanda Marsh on some other options and ideas we have. And so I just truly ask that this one parcel on 6th Street, that you give us some time to present.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Hi, my name is Amanda Marsh, and I'm the widow of Eric Marsh, the superintendent of the Granite Mountain Hotshots. I don't mean to be emotional, but this is an emotional conversation for me, as it is for many people here, representing not only people who care in the community, but also family members. And I wrote a letter that I don't need to read, but that I wanted to present to the mayor. Can I walk it up?
Bring it up. Okay, thank you. Okay.
We, as the families, have been working together all weekend to figure out something to do. And like Deborah Finkston was saying, we have many options and many ideas, and we would just like a little time to be able to see if we can bring any of those options into fruition. I don't know if that's possible for 6th and Easy Street. The other thing that I wanted to talk about were the buggies, and I know that that wasn't on your agenda today. But we have two options for the buggies to be donated to two different fire museums, one in Los Angeles County and one in Phoenix. And we would really appreciate the opportunity to move these to safe locations. So I hope that we can work together to figure out a way to make this transition something that the families can be part of. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Chief Light, I guess you heard about the buggies?
Yes, sir, I have, and they've approached me, and that is most certainly doable if that is the policy direction. The intrinsic value of that, I think, last time, without going into a lot of finite details, for them combined is really kind of minuscule. There would be a return of perhaps up to $12,000 combined, I think, is the last number that the fleet folks gave to us. But it's most certainly doable, and as a resource for us, they've come past their need here in our community for fire services, and I would support such a decision if that is policy direction.
Okay, thank you. City Manager, I guess it's going to take some time to work through this packet and decide on what we want to sell and how we want to sell it and whether or not we're going to put it out for bids for sale. So what time do you think that's going to take, and would give them an opportunity to put a committee together and come back in and talk to us?
I think practically, if I've understood the wishes of this council, moving in a somewhat expeditious manner is what we're looking to do. I would define that as maybe a month or two. Does that sound realistic?
Well, it takes, I know this, to split something, regardless of your entity, if you're splitting a lot or consolidating, I mean, a lot of times you've got to do an ALTA survey, you've got to bring in engineering, you know, we got to do the RFP for engineering and to get those folks to split the lot. Splitting them is probably too much. all those things we were talking about.
So maybe more like
But I
90
think as
days.
long as we're showing intent to the public of what we're doing, that I see no rush of making a decision right now on that particular parcel right now.
And Mayor and Council, remember, whatever the policy decision is, you always have the ability to lease property as a revenue stream to the general fund, as they said, as a revenue stream versus a one-time sale of the property. And you kind of base your lease rates on what your cap rate is, what you want your return to be. So if you had a property that you were going to sell for $1 million and you got $100,000 a year, in 10 years you basically get your money out of it. And if you have a 20-year lease, you're actually making more money over the long term. So that and leases actually is a really flexible way for the city to dispose of unnecessary property and have a revenue stream. So that's always an option in this conveying of surplus properties discussion, is or long-term, especially on commercial properties that have some return on investment. So that's something to probably consider during the exec session. What are the options? Do we want to sell it, a one-time deal, or do we want to see if we can lease it as a revenue stream?
And probably going parcel by parcel to make those determinations is the best way to do this.
So how long do you think it'll take to put together your committee and come up with ideas?
Once you light a fire under us, we're going to move mountains to make it happen.
Okay, thank you.
As long as you give permission to your fire department and police department to talk to us at any time. NAU is already willing to talk. The president of NAU is ready to come down. State Forester Jeff Whitney is ready to come down. So as long as we can set up a place and meet at Station 7, we'll do it.
You're more than welcome to meet with both the fire and the police. And good luck with it all.
Thank you so much.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. The word expeditiously doesn't trump compassionately when it comes to this topic with the community. We've discussed leasing property in the past, and when the property's gone, it's gone. When it's leased, it's still ours. And that being a valuable property, it's not as though it's out in Ethiopia someplace. It's right here on the corner, up the street here, So I would like to see the opportunities to lease some of our properties rather than divest ourselves totally. I think there's a value in property that's differently than just the once a sale's been made and the money's gone, so is the property. So, there's more than one way to skin a cat when it talks about using public assets. And in this particular case, let's just be real judicious on how we approach this.
And I know that a number of years ago, there was discussion about talking with the wildland organization that runs the museum up in Boise to so there are ways of generating revenue from a lease that further generate other revenue if it becomes some type of attraction or school. So I think from an economic standpoint, you have to look at if you're selling it off, versus if you're leasing it, and that lease use then turns into some other type of, whether it's sales tax generator or attraction or something. That's the economics of the deal that you really have to look at to fully assess the sort of best financial deal for the city, along with all the other kind of intangible issues.
Okay, next.
David Turbeville. I have DT Products down on Easy Street. Yesterday I stopped by the city office and dropped off a flyer to four of the council members and the city manager. I have to speak with Mayor. Thank you for taking the time. I, of course, own a manufacturing company facility right adjacent to, I'd be north of the storage yard of the Granite Mountain Crew Quarters area. And yes, I have some interest in that piece of property to expand my deal. On the other side of stuff is during the talks about the amount of sales tax revenue and the different things, that I'm a little bit off topic in terms of all the properties, but one of the things that I might suggest to you when you go forward with the sales, this vote initiative maybe you should consider doing it asking for a 1% and do a renewal like in 4 or 6 years. In other words, you guys need, the council needs to make, the best case. Past councils, really, quite honestly, the last time these came across the vote, they didn't do their job. I mean, at least not from what I saw. They really weren't for it, neither was the public. So now you're doing a lot of other things, and I'm glad to see that. But if you give the public maybe an opportunity to reevaluate it every 4 or 6 years as opposed to just a 10-year deal, I know that it may take 10 years to get it down where you'd like, Councilman Orr. The other thing that I wanted to point out is you talked about possibly borrowing money within the city from like the water deal. I'm actually sort of in favor of that proposal, but I actually think that that you should be returning it an interest rate back to the water fund. So if you're willing to pay $6.5 million to investors or the power brokers to do a bond, you should be able to pay the water holders, stakeholders in this community, basically that same amount of interest. I mean, split it in half. So I guess those are the points that I have to make. And again, to Amanda Marsh's point and stuff, as I'm a family member as well, if Station 7, if the crew quarters could be turned into something of a museum piece or an educational piece, a lot of the off-season that, the city of Prescott needs bodies to spend money on sales tax revenues, okay? So whether you get the tax increase or not, if you can increase saleable stuff, if you bring firefighters in during the winter months when they're not fighting fires to do training, and they do a lot of programs, if they could make this a training area. So like I put on the back of my little thing, let's make it right by the Granite Mountain crew. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Jerry Brady. I've had to deal with some of these same issues as a civilian employee of the Department of Defense. Main base mode operations are operated largely by civilian personnel who operate under the same legal standards for law enforcement, fire protection, emergency medical services. I had fiduciary duties for management of the retirement and disability pension funds for those civilian employees. The U.S. government has exactly the same problems you do. So do many other states and territories for the United States. For example, Puerto Rico is considering bankruptcy. Very difficult for a municipal government, but they're actually petitioning U.S. Congress for permission to do it. I'd like to point out that Investors Business Daily, the International Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Wall Street Journal have done very extensive studies on exactly these same problems. One of the things you need to know is that according to the Wall Street Journal, Investors Business Daily, and the Chamber of Commerce is that the Dow composite, the NASDAQ, and other composites do not track the performance of PSPRS funds. Quite often, the NASDAQ and Dow were showing returns above 9%, but the stability zone for PSPRS during the last 8 years was 4%. However, that was what was needed to maintain financial stability in these systems nationwide, not just in Arizona, but throughout the entire nation. The actual performance tracked about 2% for PSPRS nationwide. In December, the last month, for which we had figures, the declining ratio passing through 2% became a negative 2% in December. The values for January have not yet been published. However, we had a historical spike in the returns on municipal funds in January, the first half, but then we had a historic decline in the second half, which wiped out any of the improvements during the first half in January. The long-term estimate by the Wall Street Journal and Investors Business Daily and the Chamber of Commerce is that the U.S. government and municipal governments both have run up huge debts. And our total indebtedness actually on a percentile basis is approaching those which caused England to emerge from Brexit. We have a huge accumulated debt in the national venue, which in many cases translates to the type of counterpart funds they're going to be providing to municipal governments, because they're trading in some of the same bond markets that you are, particularly with regard to the public safety personnel retirement systems. So I would like to suggest that anything you do, take into accountability what the Wall Street Journal, Investors Business Daily, and the Chamber of Commerce is saying about probability that we're going to have an austerity program like Greece or Ireland or Puerto Rico in order to deal with these accumulated debts. Because what's happening is we're accruing annual interest, compounding. And that means that any unpaid debts is going to go up at much more than the regular interest rate, which they are going to peg at 6%. That means any bonded debts you take on are going to cost you 6% compounding, maybe 9 to 12%. So you're not merely looking at an increase on the revenue from any bonds that you sell or buy, you're looking at the cost of doing business in any bonded debt you take on. You really need to consider what the Wall Street Journal Investors Business Daily is saying about the problem with the long-term debt on public safety personnel retirement systems as opposed to your general fund debt. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Next.
Mr. Mayor and Councilman, my name is Phil Good. I'm a Prescott resident. Just a point of clarity, I agree with the previous gentleman, but probably not in as much detail. If we can look at that slide again on page 4 with the PSPRS required contribution. That's a pretty rosy scenario, and that scenario, as Mr. Woodfill indicated, assumes a growing 2% increase in sales tax over that period of time, and also reaching the 7.4% projected expected rate of return. It's generally accepted accounting principle that for every 1/4% of reduced return, you add approximately 10% to your unfunded liability. So if we, as I mentioned in previous comments, had even a 6% return instead of 7.4, our liability would increase about 60%, and we would end up with a $30 million balance in 2028. If we brought it down to 5%, which, as I mentioned, Stanford University's study of pension systems indicate is a more reasonable long-term projection, we would double our total liability from $80 million to $160 million, and 10 years from now we would have an $80 million balance, which is where we are today. So I think the public in general needs to have a clearer understanding of what this 0.75% would really provide in realistic terms. If we had a 5% return, we'd still have the same balance. So we would have to push that out from instead of 10 years, maybe to 20 years. My other only question is what is the current Moody and Fitch rating for the city?
Double A, is it not? It's double A. It's an S&P rating, is it not?
Well, I know the
Fujimoto.
YC, excuse me, Yavapai Regional Medical Centers just refinanced $50 million worth of bonds with a BBB plus rating, and they were able to float that at less than 5%.
Was it a tax-exempt bond, or was it not a tax-exempt?
I don't know the answer to that. But that's an investment grade rating, and yours is even better, so okay. I would expect that you're probably going to get a better number than that. My last point was when municipalities acquire assets such as real estate for legitimate purposes, and I'm sure there were at the time, and those assets are no longer generating useful returns, then I think it's up to the municipalities to eliminate those liabilities. And, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem, I know you've argued a number of times about acquiring additional land because you acquire the liabilities that come along with them. So being able to remove those assets from the city's portfolio, return the dollars so we can use them for a very important need would be a valuable decision, and it certainly would eliminate any liabilities on those properties as well.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Good afternoon. Ted Ralston, past fuels management supervisor for the Prescott Fire Department. Not a city resident or not a pensioner. So what I'm here to say is I don't envy the position that you guys are in. You look at the charts, you know the debt, and you know the liabilities that you have. You have that responsibility to protect the finances of the city, do the best you can with the tax dollars, and provide services for the residents. But you also have a responsibility to preserve the legacy of the city. And I think the 6th Street property is a major part of the city's legacy, and we could really turn this around to a positive outcome. So I appreciate you guys willing to take the chance, or take the time rather, to evaluate this situation on this property a little bit more. So I know you guys don't get a lot of applause, but I applaud you for that. Thank you.
Thank you. We probably got time for a couple more comments if there's any. Go ahead. You can go back up again.
Thank you for the consideration. I'd like to point out with regard to acquiring federal property for redistribution. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt set aside water resources for the town of Prescott and for other municipal incorporations within this survey district, part of the U.S. Public Land Survey System. This was a distribution of water rights previously owned under military and martial law through the Office of the Trooper Commander at Fort Whipple for the operation of the National Strategic Mineral Reserves, mining claims, primarily the revestment of foreign claims to mining rights, including hydraulic and placer mines in Yavapai County. So you have a water right that is reserved under military and martial law, Titles 10 and 32, United States Code, to preemption claims by the city of Prescott. This has not been invalidated in any terms. However, the issue here is you do not acquire title to the ownership of the water rights. You have a guaranteed service right to ownership of the use. It still is owned by the U.S. government, but you have the right to its use as a preemption claim through Titles 10 and 32 in the Federal Fortifications Act. So you have a water right which you can only acquire as a public utilities district. You cannot acquire it as the city. You have to sponsor the formation of a public utilities district, and that water right can never be sold, exchanged, or traded. You can only operate it for the public benefit. You can't use it for infrastructure development, for example, for planned area developments, except under contract through the public utilities district. So that is the restriction on the use of these Title 10 and 32 lands. It has to be through a public utilities corporation, which the town can incorporate either by a public vote or by an administrative decision. Of course, the administrative decision doesn't have the same rights under federal law as a public vote would. But I am pretty confident, having talked with members of the public who are interested in these things, that they would definitely approve the idea of the city forming a public utilities district to acquire these Title 10 and 32, not properties, but the rights to their use. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We got time for one more person.
Dan Bauman, president of the Prescott chapter of the Firefighters Association. I just wanted to clarify one point on a gentleman came up and made a comment earlier asking about whether the PBIs or permanent benefit increases that were a portion or a part of the previous pension system before the reforms were included in this. And the permanent benefit increases have completely gone away across all pension tiers. And for active, future, and retired. The only increases that are happening from now on are tied to the consumer price index, and only there's a maximum of 2% that it can go up to, and those only occur if there is inflation. And for the moving forward for the new hires, it's also only based upon fund performance. So I just wanted to clarify there is no more permanent benefit increase in the system.
Okay, thank you. We'll take one more question. Got 5 minutes. Okay, well, if there's no more questions or comments from the council, thank you all for coming, and let me just say that we covered a couple of the items today. I don't know if you saw the chart when it was up there, but we got, I think, about 4 more areas to look at, and I think, City Manager, you're looking at some that the Reason Foundation also
brought forward. That's
brought
correct.
forward to us to take a look at.
We're trying to check off at least a discussion of 2 per week till we get through this.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
I know this is a gray area, City Attorney. Concerning the buggies, can that be agenda items or can it be administrative?
If it's over $3,000, then the council has to approve the sale of those or the giving away of those. And it sounds like they're worth about $6,000 each, if my math is correct. So I think it'd be something that staff should bring to the council at some point as a proposal, whether it's to go to a museum as a gift, lack of a better term, or a loan or something where the city may still own those, but if they're going to be put into a museum, they can be done on sort of a museum loan kind of deal versus giving them away completely, or we can give them away as surplus, non-usable, which I think they meet that criteria, but I would defer to the chief on that, whether we could ever really use them again as a practical matter.
Thank you.
They're probably surplus.
Also, City Manager, when's our next PSPRS study session? Are we going to be doing it just before the next voting meeting, or is that already taken up with other subjects?
I thought we were going to try to deal with this next week.
We can do more.
Yeah, we can. And, I was looking at the list. There's not as many action items that go with the rest of these points. I mean, some of them are just, the last one's dedicated sales and privilege tax. I mean, that's a council decision you need to get to at some point. I mean, there may be follow-up things from today, too, that you guys want to ask me about as well. And there may be things that come out of the executive session regarding selling the unneeded property that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I think it's critical, Michael, for you and your staff to take a look at what makes sense to get rid of. We don't want to maintain liabilities out in the hinterland if we can get rid of them. On the other hand, we do want to maintain things that can be generating dollars back into the general fund to help function this community. Perfect examples over on 6th Street. There are things that can be done with that property differently than just peddling it. On the other hand, when you go out to the Big Chino, 90 miles out in the middle of nowhere, that's a different issue. We're liable for whatever takes place out there. That's a different type of property than the one over on the corner.
Point well taken, Mayor Pro Tem. I appreciate that.
Okay, you got one comment?
Yes, sir. Brennan McDonough, resident of Prescott. Regarding the buggies, so from what I understand, that's going to be an administrative decision. I think that's something, from my understanding, if they're valued at $12,000, correct, Chief Light?
Actually, it sounds like it's going to be a council decision because it's more than $3,000 per buggy.
Okay, so how could we help on our end, maybe speed that process up so it's off your plate? Is there anything we can do from our end to
Well,
make sure that
if there's museums that are interested in these resources and you guys want to draft some correspondence, and I don't know what the correspondence that was given to the mayor, but if it said what the plan was or what your plan was with these, at least it can be considered by the city council.
Okay.
Does that sound reasonable to everybody?
Good to see you, Brendan.
Likewise, thank you.
Mayor, I'll chime in as well. I think I can work with the parties that are interested in this particular approach and then perhaps bring something back for you all to consider.
And I guess my question would be, is that something we could put at the next voting meeting?
If you guys are interested in proceeding with that quicker, I don't see any reason you couldn't. If you'd like to have that decision made in the next 30 days, we probably could do that. Is that the consensus?
I think the next meeting, which is next Tuesday, may be a little tight schedule-wise, the second February meeting or first
February.
March is certainly doable, depending on how quickly Chief Light can get the job done.
We'll try to do it for the end of February, and if not, the beginning of March.
Okay,
All right.
thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. This meeting's adjourned.